One writer has challenged the current accepted view that ancient Troy, if it ever existed, was located in western Turkey. Dutch author Imman Wilkins has controversially argued that the city of Troy was actually located in Cambridgeshire, England, and that the Trojan War was fought between different groups of Celts. Ancient Troy. The legendary city of Troy, scene of the 10-year-long Trojan War, is inextricably linked with some of the most prominent characters in Greek myth, from the goddess Hera, Athena and Aphrodite, and the matchless beauty of Helen, to the action heroes Achilles, Paris and Odysseus. Most people are familiar with the story of the fall of Troy, particularly after the release of the 2004 film Troy, starring Brad Pitt as Achilles. This mighty conflict caused by the love of Paris for Helen only ended when the Greeks introduced the Trojan horse. But did the war actually take place, and was there a city called Troy? The story of Troy was first told in Homer's Iliad, written around 750 BC. Details were added by later writers such as the Roman poet Virgil and another Roman poet, Ovid, in Metamorphoses. Most ancient Greek historians, such as Herodotus, were convinced of the history of the Trojan War. These writers took Homer at his word and placed Troy on a hill overlooking the Hellespont, modern Dardanelles, the narrow strait between the Aegean and Black Seas. This was a position of huge strategic importance in terms of trade. For hundreds of years, explorers and antiquarians fascinated by the legend of Troy searched the area known in antiquity as the Troad, now part of northwestern Turkey. Where was Troy? The most famous and successful searcher for the great city of Troy was German businessman Heinrich Schliemann. Guided by the Iliad of Homer, he decided that Troy was located on a mound at Issyk-Kul, a few kilometers from the Dardanelles, and began excavations there in 1870, continuing until 1890. Here he discovered the remains of a series of ancient cities beginning in the early Bronze Age around the 3rd millennium BC and ending in the Roman period. Believing Troy must be located in the lower levels, he quickly and carelessly hacked through the upper levels, irrevocably destroying much vital evidence in the process. In 1873, he unearthed a variety of gold artifacts, which he dubbed Priam's treasure, and announced to the world that he had found Homer's Troy. There has been much debate about whether or not Schliemann actually found the gold artifacts in the place where he claimed, or if he had planted them there to verify his claims that the site was in fact the fabled city of Troy. Schliemann is known to have distorted the facts on more than one occasion. Although he claimed to have discovered the site of Troy at Issyk himself, when Schliemann first visited the Troad, English archaeologist and diplomat Frank Calvert had already been excavating on part of the area for some time, as it was on his family's land. The spectacular gold finds discovered by Schliemann are now believed to have come from a much earlier city on the mound than he believed. The city Schliemann thought was Homer's Troy, in fact, dates from 2400 to 2200 BC, 10,000 years before the generally accepted date for the Trojan War. So, could ancient Troy have been located somewhere else entirely? Troy in England. There is an interesting ancient legend regarding a person known as Gomagog, who was apparently the last survivor of a mythical race of giants that ruled the island of Albion before the arrival of Brutus of Troy and his Trojan followers. Brutus of Troy was a descendant of Trojan prince Aeneas, who was exiled after accidentally killing his father in a hunting accident. He set out on an epic sea voyage, searching for new lands for he and his followers to settle in, eventually arriving in Britain after many years. Years later, Brutus founded New Troy on the banks of the River Thames, which would one day become known as London. Geoffrey of Monmouth, in the History of the Kings of Britain, narrates the history of the British kings up to Cadwallader, the last line that began with Brutus of Troy. Written about 1136, the book tells the story of how the Trojans came into conflict with Gog-Magog and the giants of Albion. The names Gog and Magog appear in a number of ancient historical texts of various religions, frequently linked to the end of days and the apocalypse. Sometimes Gog is a person and Magog is the name of a land. Most scholars now believe that Geoffrey probably joined together the biblical characters of Gog and Magog into one to create a more commanding identity for the giant. In his controversial book from 1991, Where Troy Once Stood, author Iman Wilkins argued that Homer's work do not fit the topography, geology, or climate of the Eastern Mediterranean. He also suggests that Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, despite being considered among the classics of ancient Greek culture, were originally epic poems from Western Europe, perhaps Germany or Holland. Wilkins describes the Odyssey as both an initiation story and an oral map for Celtic seafarers in the Atlantic Ocean. Wilkins was not to be the first to suggest a northwestern origin for the Trojan War. At the end of the 19th century, Belgian lawyer Théophile Cowler put forward similar ideas, but they were all but consigned to obscurity when Schliemann located what he believed to be Troy in western Turkey soon afterwards. According to Wilkins, the city of Troy was located near the Gog-Magog Hills, which extend for several miles to the southeast of Cambridge in eastern England. The Celts living here were attacked around 1200 BC by Celts coming from the European continent in a battle over tin mines 325 miles away in Cornwall. This tin resource was highly valued during the Bronze Age, as mixed together with copper it could be made into bronze. The book also explains that zodiacal signs hidden in Homer's text enable the author to retrace all of Odysseus's ports of call in the epic. Much of the evidence Wilkins gives in his work is based on place names. According to him, the Cambridge area has rivers bearing names that are strikingly similar to the ones in the Iliad, such as the Ree, the Roding, and the Thames, which he compares to Homer's Rhesus, Rhodius, and Temize. Wilkins also contends that Homer's Greek contains a large number of loanwords from Western European language, more often from Dutch rather than English, French, or German. Wilkins was, of course, Dutch. He doesn't explain in his book, however, how languages that did not exist until around 1,000 years later could have been the source of Homer's place names. Wilkins' extreme theories are not unsurprisingly completely rejected by archaeologists and classical scholars. Indeed, for such a radical theory to be proven true, there would have to be more evidence than a few similarities of names, none of which have been proved to be contemporary with the date of the Trojan War. On the contrary, there is contemporary evidence from Greece of names featured in Homer in the form of the Linear B tablets from the palaces of Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and elsewhere. These inscribed clay tablets, which date from between 1400 and 1200 BC, include many Homeric details, such as the names Achilles and Hector, and others that were common names during the late Bronze Age, Mycenaean times in Greece. The tablets also include the names of the cities that they came from, which match their traditional locations in mainland Greece. The city of Mycenae, written about by Homer, had been known about since classical times, even though the site had long been abandoned. The Linear B tablets reveal that the name Mycenae was even used in Mycenaean times. A number of words which Homer used that had died out by the classical era, including wanax, which means leader, have been found on these tablets, showing that he must have obtained them from older Greek words. Perhaps most tellingly of all, the vast majority of cities described in the Iliad can be linked with sites in Greece. Pylos, Sparta, Ithaca, Thebes, and so on are all locations that still bear names given by Homer. But more significantly, the names of cities recorded by Homer, but unknown in later classical Greek times, have since been identified by archaeology in the areas he mentions. This means that Homer was recording the names of Greek cities that hadn't existed since the Mycenaean era, at least 400 years before his writing. Despite competing theories, Issyk-Kul is now widely accepted as the setting for Homer's epic tales. Studies have revealed that the 100-foot-high mound on the site contains not just one, but 9 Troys, each built over the ruins of the one before. The general consensus among archaeologists now is that Troy Vla, which dates from the mid-13th century BC to around 950 BC, is the most likely candidate, for Homer's Troy. Recent research in Brazil has revealed the discovery of an ancient megalithic observatory built at least 5 centuries before the European conquest of the Americas began. This finding, along with other archaeological fascinating discoveries in Brazil in recent years, which include giant land carvings, remains of fortified settlements, and complex road networks, are challenging the earlier views that the Amazon had been untouched by humans except for small nomadic tribes. Nearly all the discoveries were made after a period of widespread deforestation in the Amazon in the early 90s through to the mid-2000s. For decades, the Amazon was thought by archaeologists to have been almost uninhabited rainforest, but recently researchers have been finding new evidence that the area was in fact a hive of human activity and home to millions of people. In March 2018, a study funded by National Geographic and the European Research Council Project PAST revealed details of 81 sites in the previously unexplored territory of the Amazon's upper Tapajós basin. Settlements discovered in the area ranged from small villages of around 100 feet wide to a large site covering 19 hectares. The sites were first discovered by satellite imagery of the area revealed by deforestation. The remains of the settlements are represented by ditches enclosing the sites for fortification, sunken roads, and earth platforms on which houses would once have stood. Dr. Jonas Gregoria de Souza from the University of Exeter was the first author of the study. He said regarding the findings and the distribution of the sites, "The idea that the Amazon was a pristine forest, untouched by humans, home to scattered nomadic populations, we already know that was not true. The big debate is how populations were distributed in pre-Columbian times in the Amazon. The idea was that in the areas that are located further away from the main rivers, populations maybe were actually smaller and they had a negligible impact on the environment. We demonstrated that these regions may have had pretty large populations as well as in the past." Wood charcoal associated with pottery fragments from one site was carbon dated to between 1410 and 1460 AD, which fits in well with the dating of many of the sites previously discovered in the southern rim of the Amazon, which showed a peak of activity between 1250 and 1500. Models based on the team's research indicate that at the time, the southern rim of the Amazon alone could have had a population of between 500,000 and 1 million people. However, this population was soon to be decimated by the arrival of Europeans. According to de Souza, diseases traveled much faster than people, and probably this population was already weakened by diseases brought by Europeans even before the Europeans set foot in the area. The Solstice Archaeological Park is located near the city of Calçone in Amapá State, northern Brazil. The site contains a megalithic stone circle and is often referred to as the Amazon Stonehenge or the Brazilian Stonehenge. The megalithic site, which is located on a hilltop on the bank of the Rio Grande River, consists of 127 upright blocks of granite, each of up to 13 feet in diameter and weighing several tons, standing evenly paced in a circle measuring over 98 feet in diameter. After conducting radiocarbon testing and carrying out measurements during the winter solstice at the site, some scholars in the field of archaeoastronomy determined that an indigenous culture arranged the megaliths into an astronomical observatory about 1,000 years ago, or 5 centuries before the European conquest of the Americas began, and 3,500 years after the building of Stonehenge. Archaeologists theorize that the site, referred to in academic sources as APCA-18, was constructed by a sophisticated indigenous people for astronomical, ceremonial, or burial purposes, or even a combination of all three. One of the stones at the site has a circular hole carved into it. During the winter solstice, the sun shines directly through this hole onto another rock, supporting the idea that the Amazonian Stonehenge was used as an astronomical site. According to the New York Times, the site was discovered by a cattle rancher named Lealsan Camilo de Silva. Apparently, Da Silva was removing trees in the late 1990s to make land for his cattle to graze on when he discovered the stones. In reality, Da Silva already knew they were there, having initially found them in the 60s, but he said he had avoided the site because he felt that it was sacred. Recently, hundreds of huge earthworks known as geoglyphs have been discovered in western Brazil, revealing the last remnants of land used by ancient societies before the dense foliage of the Amazon rainforest concealed them centuries ago. The peak period of forest burning to clear land happened between 2300 and 1400 years ago, during which the first earthworks are believed to have been constructed. While the form and extent of these sites can be determined using aerial observations, researchers are still not sure what the original purpose of the sites was. Many of the structures are unlikely to have been villages, as excavation at the sites has not revealed the substantial amounts of cultural artifacts which would be expected if they had been habitation sites. The layout of the sites also suggests that they weren't built for defensive purposes. One explanation which has been put forward is that the areas were used for ritual gatherings of some kind, and so would have been visited only intermittently by those who once lived in the area. Archaeologist Jennifer Watling has compared the layout of the sites with England's Stonehenge, saying, "It's interesting to note that the format of the geoglyphs, with an outer ditch and inner wall enclosure, are what are classically described as henge sites. The earliest phases at Stonehenge consisted of a similarly laid out enclosure." In November 2020, it was announced in the press that one of the world's largest collections of prehistoric rock art had been discovered in the Amazonian rainforest. The discovery, described as the Sistine Chapel of the Ancients, consisted of tens of thousands of paintings of animals and humans created up to 12,500 years ago on cliff faces stretching across nearly 8 miles in Colombia. The date of the artwork was based partially on images of now extinct Ice Age animals, such as the mastodon, a prehistoric relative of the elephant that had been extinct in South America for at least 12,000 years. There are also depictions of Paleolama, an extinct camelid, as well as giant sloths and Iron Age horses, all seen at first hand and painted by some of the very first humans ever to reach the Amazon. Other images include fish, turtles, lizards and birds, as well as people dancing and holding hands, with one figure wearing a mask resembling a bird with a beak. The incredible discovery was filmed for a major Channel 4 series called Jungle Mystery: Lost Kingdoms of the Amazon. The documentary's presenter, archaeologist and explorer Ella Al-Shamahi, said of the extraordinary findings, "This site is so new they haven't even given it a name yet." The discovery was made by a British Columbian team funded by the European Research Council. The researchers' team leader, a professor of archaeology at Exeter University and a leading expert on the Amazon and pre-Columbian history, said, "When you're there, your emotions flow. We're talking about several tens of thousands of paintings. It's going to take generations to record them. Every turn you do, it's a new wall of paintings. We started seeing animals that are now extinct. The pictures are so natural and so well made that we have few doubts that you're looking at a horse, for example. The Ice Age horse has a wild, heavy face. It's so detailed, we can even see the horsehair. It's fascinating." The site of the discovery is so remote that after a 2-hour drive, a team of archaeologists and filmmakers had to trek on foot for around 4 hours to find it. Even after arriving at the site, the team found that some of the paintings were placed so high up that they could only be viewed with drones. Al-Shamahi remarked on the incredible depiction of Ice Age life in the Amazon as suggested by the newly discovered paintings. One of the most fascinating things was seeing Ice Age megafauna, because that's a marker of time. I don't think people realize that the Amazon has shifted in the way it looks. It hasn't always been a rainforest. When you look at a horse or mastodon in these paintings, of course, they weren't going to live in a forest. They're too big. Not only are they giving clues about when they were painted by some of the earliest people, that in itself is just mind-boggling. But they're also giving clues about what this very spot might have looked like. More savanna-like. Nan Madol is located near the southern side of the Federated States of Micronesia and is the only ancient city ever built on top of a coral reef. The ruined city is one of today's great archaeological mysteries and is sometimes interpreted as the remains of one of the lost continents of Atlantis, Lemuria or Mu. In fact, Nan Madol was one of the sites James Churchward identified as being part of the lost continent of Mu in his book, The Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Man. The ruins of the ancient city complex of Nan Madol are located on a coral reef in a lagoon on the minuscule town of Temwen, close to the eastern shore of the island of Pompne in the federal states of Micronesia. Nan Madol is composed of 92 artificial islands spread over 200 acres. Surrounded by water on three sides with a stone wall enclosing the complex, the city complex is sometimes referred to as the Venice of the Pacific. Although there is evidence of human activity at the site dating back to the 1st or 2nd century BC, the construction of artificial islets did not begin until around the 8th and 9th century AD. The majority of the megalithic structures were built from the 13th to the 17th centuries by the Sordeleurs, descendants of two brothers possessed of magic powers who founded a religious community in the 6th century AD based on the worship of the sea. The focus of the whole megalithic complex is the royal mortuary at the islet of Nandawas, with its 20-foot-high walls surrounding the central tomb enclosure. Throughout its 500-year existence, the city was a political and ceremonial seat of power, serving as a religious center, a royal residence, a fortress, an urban marketplace, and the seat of local government. The population of Nan Madol during its heyday was probably over 1,000 people, the majority of whom were commoners serving the nobility. At the beginning of the 13th century AD, the island of Pohnpei is thought to have been conquered and unified by the mysterious Sordeleur dynasty, and it was then that the spectacular complex was constructed as a ceremonial and political seat for a new royal line. The Sordeleur line was brought to an end in the 1500s by exiled Pompeian warrior Issyk-Kul. The new chiefs, known as Namwaki, occupied Nan Madol for a couple of hundred years, but by the 1800s, when the first Europeans arrived, the site was deserted. Why remains one of the many mysteries of this incredible site. There are certainly mysteries surrounding Nan Madol. Some of the stones and columns at Nan Madol are so substantial that no one has been able to work out how the site was constructed. The Pompeians had nothing to fix the stones together like concrete, nor are they known to have had diving equipment. So it's a mystery how they sank the heavy stones into the lagoon. A clue to how the transportation of the great megaliths were moved may lie in crystal basalt columns discovered at the bottom of the lagoon near Temwen Island and on the shores of other islets in the area, which would suggest that the stones were transported by raft. According to local legend, the stones used in the construction of Nan Madol were magically flown to the site by the two brothers who supposedly founded the complex. Although archaeologists have located several possible quarry sites on the main island, the exact method of transportation of the construction material has still not been determined. But the site of Nan Madol has been linked with much greater enigmas than the method of its construction. One controversial theory connects the site with lost continents beneath the Pacific Ocean. Lemuria and Mu are interchangeable names given to the lost land believed to have been located somewhere in either the southern Pacific or Indian Oceans. This ancient continent was apparently the home of an advanced and highly spiritual culture, perhaps the mother race of all mankind, but it sank beneath the waves many thousands of years ago as a result of a geological cataclysm of some kind. The thousands of rocky islands scattered throughout the Pacific, including Easter Island, Tahiti, Hawaii, and Samoa, have been claimed by some to be the only surviving remains of this once great continent. Lemuria, the alternative name for the lost continent, also originated in the 19th century. Ernst Heinrich Haeckel, from 1834 to 1919, a German naturalist and supporter of Darwin, proposed that a land bridge spanning the Indian Ocean separating Madagascar from India could explain the widespread distribution of lemurs, small, primitive tree-dwelling mammals found in Africa, Madagascar, India, and the East Indian archipelago. More bizarrely, Haeckel also suggested that lemurs were the ancestors of the human race and that this land bridge was the probable cradle of the human race. Other well-known scientists, such as the evolutionist T.H. Huxley and the naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, had no doubt about the existence of a huge continent in the Pacific millions of years previously, which had been destroyed in a disastrous earthquake that submerged it between the waves, much as Atlantis was thought to have been drowned. Before the discovery of continental drift, it was not unusual in the mid-late 19th century for scientists to propose submerged landmasses and land bridges to explain the distribution of the world's flora and fauna. In 1864, the English zoologist Philip Lutley Sclater, from 1829 to 1913, gave the hypothetical continent the name Lemuria in an article, The Mammals of Madagascar, in the Quarterly Journal of Science, and since then it has stuck. The theory of a lost continent in this area has been put forward by many different people, most notably in the mid-19th century by scientists in order to explain the unusual distribution of various animals and plants around the Indian and Pacific Oceans. The idea of Lemuria as something more than a physical place, or at least somewhere which had been inhabited by non-human entities before the appearance of man, derives from the writings of a colorful Russian occultist, Helena Petrovska Blavatsky, from 1831 to 1891. Blavatsky was the co-founder, together with lawyer Henry Steele Olcott, of the Theosophical Society in New York in 1875. The society was an esoteric order designed to study the mystical teachings of both Christianity and Eastern religions. In the late 19th century, occultist Madame Blavatsky reincarnated the idea of Lemuria as a lost continent, spiritual homeland, and influenced a host of subsequent occultists and mystics, including well-known American psychic healer and prophet Edgar Cayce. The popularization of Lemuria, Mu, as a purely physical place began in the 20th century with ex-British Army officer Colonel James Churchward, and the idea still has many adherents today. The lost civilization of Lemuria, Mu, was brought dramatically back to public attention in 1931 with the publication of Colonel James Churchward's bizarre The Lost Continent of Mu, the first in a series of 5 books by Churchward about the lost continent. In the book, he claimed that the lost continent of Mu had once extended from an area north of Hawaii southwards as far as Fiji and Easter Island. According to Churchward, Mu was the original Garden of Eden and a technologically advanced civilization which boasted 64 million inhabitants. Around 12,000 years ago, Mu was wiped out by an earthquake and submerged beneath the Pacific. Apparently, Atlantis, a colony of Mu, was destroyed in the same way 1,000 years later. All the world's major ancient civilizations, from the Babylonians and the Persians to the Maya and the Egyptians, were the remains of the colonies of Mu. Churchward claimed he received this sensational information when, as a young officer in India during a famine in the 1880s, he became friendly with an Indian priest. The priest told Churchward that he and 2 cousins were the only survivors of a 70,000-year-old esoteric order which originated on Mu itself. This order was known as the Nakal Brotherhood. The priest showed Churchward a number of ancient tablets written by the Nakal order in a forgotten ancient language, supposed to be the original language of mankind, which he taught the officer to read. Churchward later asserted that certain stone artifacts recovered in Mexico contain parts of the sacred-inspired writings of Mu, perhaps taking ideas from Augustus Le Plongeon and his use of the Troana Codex to provide evidence for the existence of Mu. It was Churchward who first posited the theory that the Cyclopedian ruins of Nan Madol represent the remains of one of the 7 cities of ancient Mu, Lemuria. However, radiocarbon dates and analysis of pottery from Nan Madol revealed the construction of the site began around 1200 AD. though the area may have been occupied from as early as 200 BC. Such dates would certainly preclude any connection with Churchward's Lemurians or their descendants. Indeed, Churchward never produced any evidence to back up his exotic claims, and he never published translations of the enigmatic Nakal tablets. Though they still have many followers today, Churchward books are perhaps better read as entertainment rather than factual studies of Lemuria. According to Hindu legend, there was once a mystical kingdom located in the middle of the sea. The city was home to 900 palaces, all made of gold, and was supposed to have arisen out of the waters on the command of Lord Krishna. Recently, underwater archaeologists claim to have located what some believe to be the foundations of this fabulous lost city off the coast of modern Dwarka in western India. Char Dham, literally meaning the four abodes or seats, are the names of four pilgrimage sites in India that are widely revered by Hindus. It comprises of Badrinath, Dwarka, Puri, and Rameswaram. Dwarka is often identified with the Dwarka kingdom, the ancient kingdom of Krishna, and is believed to have been the first capital of Gujarat. According to legend, Krishna founded the city in Gujarat's west coast after he defeated and killed his uncle Kansa at Mathura. In Indian epic literature, the ancient city is also known as Dwarka. Traditionally, modern Dwarka is identified with Dwarka. Ancient Dwarka is supposed to have sank into the sea in remote history. The ancient and modern city, now known as Dwarka, is located on the western tip of the Saurashtra Peninsula in Gujarat, northwestern India. In the 14th century, the town's original temples were destroyed by the Delhi emperors, but the most important of them, Jagat Mandir, was subsequently rebuilt. Jagat Mandir, also known as the Dwarkadish Temple, is a Hindu temple dedicated to god Krishna, who is worshipped here with the name of Dwarkadish, or the King of Dwarka. The 5-story sandstone edifice is supported by 72 pillars and was constructed in the 15th to 16th centuries in the Chalukya style. It covers an area of 69 by 88.5 feet, with its spire a dizzying 257 feet high. The temple is visited by thousands of pilgrims every year. Ancient Dwarka is mentioned in a number of Indian texts, including the Mahabharata, the Shrimad, and the Bhagavad Gita. The Mahabharata describes Dwarka as having 900,000 royal palaces, all constructed of crystal and silver and decorated with emeralds. The ancient city was connected by an elaborate system of boulevards, roads, marketplaces, assembly houses, and temples. Archaeological investigations in the city of Dwarka and offshore in the Arabian Sea have been undertaken by the Archaeological Survey of India since the 1960s. Over the past decade or so, underwater excavations have uncovered interesting remains at a depth of 120 feet in the Gulf of Cambay off the western coast of India. Some reports claim these discoveries could be over 9,000 years old and cover an area 5 miles long and 2 miles wide. Marine archaeologists have used a technique known as sub-bottom profiling to reveal that the building's remains stand on enormous foundations. One news report in the New Indian Express from August 2018 stated sensationally, marine scientists say archaeological remains discovered 36 meters, 120 feet underwater in the Gulf of Cambay off the western coast of India could be over 9,000 years old. It's believed to predate the oldest known remains in the subcontinent by more than 5,000 years. Carbon dating on debris recovered from the site, including construction material, pottery, sections of walls, beads, sculpture, and human bones and teeth, put it at nearly 9,500 years old, making it older than the Sumerian civilization by several thousand years. It's also older than the Egyptian and Chinese civilizations. The city is believed to be even older than the ancient Harappan civilization. Sandstone walls and a grid of streets and other evidence of a seaport 70 feet underwater, alongside artifacts dating back to 7,500 BC, have convinced some researchers that finally the legendary city of 900,000 royal palaces has been located. The archaeological explorations off the coast of Dwarka have also brought to light a large number of stone structures. These are semicircular, rectangular and square stone edifices scattered randomly over a vast area. Besides these structures, many varieties of stone anchors have been uncovered alongside the structures as well. Such findings suggest that the ancient Dwarka was once a busy port, though these structures are thought to date to comparatively late in the site's history, probably belonging to the late medieval period. Indeed, various Indian historians have stated that the stone anchors match those used in the Indo-Arab trade from the 8th to 14th century AD. However, this recent date has not stopped some from claiming that the remains represent the legendary lost city of Dwarka and so must be 9,000 years old. The lead archaeologist of a number of excavations at the site, the late Dr. S.R. Rao, described the town plan of early Dwarka based on his team's discoveries. There were 2 fortification walls, one on the lower terrace and other in the middle terrace. These walls, which extend over a length of 4 kilometers on the eastern shore, are mostly destroyed by sea action. The walls of the lower terrace are of massive dressed sandstone blocks, while that of the upper terrace are of rubble. The houses and other public buildings, built of smaller size stones within the enclosures, are all destroyed and leveled up by the encroachment of the sea. These structures lie at a depth of 7 to 10 meters below the present mean sea level, indicating a rise of 10 meters in sea level during the last 3,600 years. In the opinion of some researchers, the rise in sea level mentioned by Dr. Rao seems to indicate that ancient Dwarka was destroyed by a great flood. Indeed, for some archaeological proof of the existence of the Dwarka and its submergence, perhaps in the 2nd millennium BC, reflects the truth of the descriptions in the Mahabharata. For them, the finds would make the Mahabharata not merely a book of myths and legends, but to some extent a genuine account of past events. In September 2019, it seemed that final proof for the wonderful architectural achievements of ancient Dwarka have been discovered underwater off modern Dwarka. A Twitter user going by the name @JIKS shared 4 sensational photos showing ornately decorated underwater sculptures and structures, with one resembling a temple tower. There was a claim accompanying the image which stated, "Sri Krishna's Dwarka, the sunken city in Gujarat, as described in the Mahabharata. It is real, yet the Christian world says there is no proof." The tweet was retweeted over 1,500 times. However, subsequent research into the 4 images revealed the falseness of the claim. One image, showing the sculpture of a lion with its left paw resting on a ball, was traced to an underwater memorial reef near Key Biscayne in Miami, Florida. It is the largest man-made reef in the world and contains 2 statues of lions to mark the entrance to the site. It is a photo of one of these lions which was used on Twitter as proof of new discoveries from ancient Dwarka. The 3 other images were also traced to various other online sources, including various photoshopped composite images using various temple remains collected from all over the world. Consequently, it's obvious that the images used on Twitter have no connection whatsoever to ancient Dwarka. Indeed, the whole claim of a submerged civilization off the coast of Dwarka, dating back 9,000 years, rests on extremely shaky grounds. In the media accounts of the discoveries, the claim of the city being 9,000 years old is based entirely on one radiocarbon date from a single piece of wood. But this piece of wood could very easily have belonged to a tree that existed prior to these underwater remains. No other object from the excavations has actually been dated. Experts have pointed out that the area in which remains have been found has huge tidal movements which would have moved artifacts and even structures around, perhaps many miles from their original locations. Furthermore, many of these stone objects found seem to be geofacts rather than artifacts, that is, natural objects made by water and sand erosion. The argument that there's a submerged 9,000-year-old Dwarka in the area is based on the premise that a submerged coastal settlement could only have been built when sea levels were much lower, and therefore could only have been built before the end of the last ice age around 10,000 years ago. The ruins of a 2,500-year-old lost ancient civilization were recently found in a lake in Kyrgyzstan. Some researchers believe that these ancient remains may include an ancient Armenian monastery where, according to legend, the body of St. Matthew, one of Jesus' disciples, and his many relics were buried. A number of Orthodox Christians have long believed that Matthew was finally laid to rest here long after his death. Since the 19th century, Russian scientists, archaeologists and researchers from the Kyrgyz Academy of Sciences have studied ancient relics around Issyk-Kul hot lake, one of the world's highest and deepest lakes, located in a valley in the high Central Asian mountains in the Republic of Kyrgyzstan. Issyk-Kul Lake is 113 miles long, up to 37 miles wide, and has an area of 2,408 square miles. It reaches 2,192 feet in depth. The lake was first mentioned by Chinese and Islamic mapmakers at the beginning of the 8th century. Archaeological finds from the site have included petroglyphs and 3,000-year-old nomadic burial mounds known as kurgans, early Christian monasteries and medieval cities. The lake has long held a fascination for researchers as divers have been exploring its depths since as long ago as the 1860s. There was a significant rise in the water level of the lake at the end of the 14th century and the beginning of the 15th. As a result of this, the remains of various ancient cultures were submerged, including Bronze Age settlements, Saki-Usuni burial mounds of the 1st century BC, medieval towns and settlements, and Turkic monuments. Since 1985, Professor Vladimir Flosky, Vice President of the Kyrgyz Academy of Sciences, has been directing underwater surveys and excavations at Issyk-Kul, and in 2010 he joined forces with National Geographic to explore the extraordinary history of the lake. In September 2013, scientists and archaeologists from National Geographic began investigations at the lake. The team chose this site due to its position at an important location along the legendary Silk Road, with routes running along its shores. In the past, innumerable traders, caravans and nomadic tribes and armies traveled along the 113-mile-long lake, leaving an extraordinary archaeological legacy behind. The Silk Road was an ancient trade route linking China with the West, along which goods and ideas were carried between the two great civilizations of Rome and China, and later between medieval European kingdoms and China. In the Middle Ages, the area surrounding the lake was fought over by two opposing lines of descendants from Genghis Khan, the Eastern Mongols and the city-dwelling Islamic Western Mongols. The legendary Western Mongol leader, Tamerlane, was said to have fought a battle over the lake region in the early 1400s, and there are medieval records of a palace built by the conqueror on the lake shore, Issyk-Kul. Some researchers believe it's the same structure as the 15th century palace near the town of Cholpon Ata, described by the medieval Arab historian Ibn Arab-Sheikh. In December 2007, it was announced that Russian researchers had discovered important ancient remains of previously unknown culture beneath the lake. According to reports, Russian archaeologists discovered traces of a large city with an area of several square kilometers. In other words, it was a metropolis in its time. We also found Scythian burial mounds, eroded by waves over the centuries, and numerous well-preserved artifacts. Bronze battle axes, arrowheads, self-sharpening daggers, objects discarded by smiths, casting molds, and a faceted gold bar, which was a monetary unit of the time. In August of 2014, Russian news outlets published a story that divers from Tomsk State University had located another previously unknown ancient settlement beneath the lake, along with 200 artifacts. Perhaps the most fascinating find was a piece of large ceramic pot which had a stamp on it written in Armenian and Syrian scripts. This find may have been supporting evidence for the story that an Armenian monastery existed on this site in medieval times. According to Dmitry Gorn, who led the diving team, the inscribed pot fragment was truly unique. He added, "Experts are now working on the identification of the writings of the stamps, but it's supposed to be Armenian Syrian script. If this proves to be correct, it will be further evidence that there was an Armenian monastery on Issyk-Kul in the 14th century, where, according to the legends, relics of Matthew were stored. There is indeed a tradition that a monastery on this remote lake was the last resting place of evangelist St. Matthew, one of the 12 apostles of Jesus. Intriguingly, when the Russian traveller P.P. Semenov was in Venice in the 1850s, he came upon a copy of the Catalan Atlas from 1375. In this work he found a drawing of a lakeside monastery with the caption, "The spot is named Issyk-Kul. Here is a monastery of Armenian brethren which is rumoured to possess the relics of St. Matthew the Apostle and Evangelist." The extraordinary Catalan Atlas is a perpetual calendar and thematic representation of the known world produced by the Majorcan Cartographic School. The creation of the atlas has been attributed to Abraham Kresk, a Jewish cartographer from Palma, Majorca. Semenov believed that the monks probably chose a site on the Kermenti Bay, as the site was protected from rough water and rich with fish. After visiting Issyk-Kul in 1856–57, Semenov wrote, "Kermenti Bay meets these conditions, but I unfortunately did not find on the shore, nor in the drifts of the neighbouring shore, any object supporting my supposition." 50 years later, a Russian Orthodox monastery was built in the area. However, many Christians believe that Matthew the Apostle's remains were discovered in Salerno, Italy in 1080 and are now in Salerno Cathedral, which is dedicated to the saint. Apparently, St. Matthew's relics had been brought to the town in 954 AD. St. Matthew, also called St. Matthew the Evangelist and St. Matthew the Apostle, was one of the 12 apostles of Jesus Christ and the traditional author of the first synoptic gospel, the Gospel according to Matthew. According to the calling of Matthew in the biblical book of Matthew, he had been a tax collector before being called to follow Jesus. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at a tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." According to tradition, Matthew's missions later brought him to the east, perhaps Ethiopia and Persia. Stories differ as to whether he died a natural death or that of a martyr. According to another tradition, he died as a martyr in Syria, and his relics were kept there for 150 years. Apparently, his followers later fled from persecution to the depths of Asia, bringing the relics of the apostle with them. Yet another tradition holds that St. Matthew died while traveling to India and established several Christian communities on his way, one of which was Issyk-Kul. It's known that a thriving Christian Armenian community existed in Kyrgyzstan since the 1st century AD. Many artifacts were found in Chu Valley, a large valley located in North Tian Shan, including an engraved stone with a cross carrying an Armenian inscription, "Jesus our Lord." A Syrian inscription under the cross stated, "This is the grave of Johann, the Armenian bishop," and a date 772 in Armenian chronology corresponding to 1323 AD. In medieval times, 2 Armenian monasteries stood near one of the villages on the shore of the lake, Svetli Mis, Bright Cape. More evidence that the remains of St. Matthew may have ended up in an Armenian monastery on the lake comes from the late 19th century, when Baron Kolbaz, Russian general and explorer of Central Asia, traveled to the site. He wrote, "It is worth noting that not far from the Trinity Monastery, at the confluence of rivers Tayup and Koisu, ruins of an ancient town are found underwater. The town hosted the Armenian monastery guarding the relics of St. Matthew." Archaeological investigation of the Kermenti settlements began in 2005, when an exploratory team visited the site of the monastery and settlement. Finds from the area include bronze crosses, a signet ring with ornamentation, coloured beads, and more than 24 crucifix necklaces. Only ongoing continuous archaeological expeditions and detailed historical research can solve the mysteries of Issyk-Kul. Nevertheless, some people are convinced that this site is indeed the location of the lost Armenian monastery, and possibly the remains of St. Matthew. The city of Heracleion, home of the temple where Cleopatra was inaugurated, was swallowed by the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Egypt nearly 1,200 years ago. It was one of the most important trade centers in the Mediterranean before it sank more than a millennia ago. For centuries, the existence of Heracleion was believed to be a myth, much like the city of Atlantis is viewed today. But in 2000, the underwater archaeologist Frank Goddio finally found the sunken city after extensive underwater research in today's Abu Qir Bay. Before this modern-day discovery, Heracleion had been all but forgotten, relegated to a handful of inscriptions and phrases in ancient texts by the likes of Strabo and Diodorus. The Greek historian Herodotus, 5th century BC, writes of a great temple that was built where the mythological hero Heracles, or Heracles, first set foot in Egypt. He also claimed that Helen of Troy and Paris visited the city before their famous Trojan War. 4 centuries after Herodotus visited Egypt, the Greek photographer Strabo noted that the city of Heracleion was located to the east of Canopus at the mouth of the River Nile. The underwater archaeologist Frank Goddio is known as a pioneer of modern maritime archaeology. Goddio founded the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, IEASM, in 1987, with the aim to explore and research underwater archaeological sites. IEASM is known for having developed a systematic approach using geophysical prospecting techniques on underwater archaeological sites. By exploring the area in parallel straight lines at regular intervals, the team can identify anomalies on the sea floor, which can then be explored by divers or robots. In 1992, IEASM began mapping the area around the port of Alexandria, and in 1996 they extended their research to include Abu Qir Bay, tasked by the Egyptian government to discover Canopus, Thonis, and Heracleion, all believed to have been reclaimed by the Mediterranean Sea. This research allowed them to understand the topography and circumstances that caused submersion of the area over time. The team used information from historical texts to establish the areas of primary interest. The survey of Abu Qir Bay covered a research area of 11 by 15 kilometers, 6.8 by 9.3 miles. Beginning in 1996, the mapping of the Abu Qir Bay took years. In 1999, they discovered Canopus, and in 2000, they discovered Heracleion. The site of the sunken city of Heracleion remained hidden in the Bay of Abu Qir for so long because the remains of the ancient city are covered with sediment. The upper layer of the seafloor is made up of sand and silt deposited as it exits the River Nile. The team from IEASM was able to locate remains by creating detailed magnetic maps, which provided the evidence needed to finally pinpoint the location of Heracleion. Now submerged under the waters of the Mediterranean Sea, in its heyday, Heracleion was located at the mouth of the River Nile, 32 kilometers, 20 miles, to the northeast of Alexandria in ancient Egypt. The enormous city was an important port for trade with Greece, as well as a religious center, where sailors would dedicate gifts to the gods. The city was also politically significant, with pharaohs needing to visit the Temple of Amun to become universal sovereign. Using cutting-edge technology and in collaboration with the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, IEASM managed to locate, map, and excavate the ancient sunken city of Heracleion, which was found 10 meters, 32.8 feet, below the water and 6.5 kilometers, 4 miles, from the current-day coastline in the western part of Abu Qir Bay. After removing layers of sand and mud, divers uncovered the extraordinary well-preserved city with many of its treasures still intact. These included the main temple of Amun-Gurb, giant statues of pharaohs, hundreds of smaller statues of gods and goddesses, a sphinx, 64 ancient shipwrecks, 700 anchors, stone blocks with both Greek and Egyptian inscriptions, dozens of sarcophagi, gold coins, and weights made from bronze and stone. Among the remains of the once great city, the underwater archaeologists discovered an enormous 5.4-meter, 7.7 feet statue of Hapi, the god dedicated to the inundation of the Nile. This was one of 3 colossal red granite sculptures discovered dating back to the 4th century BC. In 2001, the team also discovered an ancient stele originally commissioned by Nectanebo I sometime between 378 and 362 BC, complete with detailed and clearly readable inscriptions. The inscriptions on this ancient stele allowed the archaeologists to determine that the ancient cities of Thonis and Heracleion were in fact one of the same. Thonis being the name used originally by the Egyptians, and Heracleion being the ancient Greek name. From then on, the ancient sunken city was known as Thonis Heracleion. Spectacular photographs of the discovery and recovery process reveal numerous statues and structures that once stood tall and mighty in the great city. One photo shows a Greco-Egyptian statue of a Ptolemaic queen, which stands eerily on the seabed, surrounded only by sediment and darkness, while another photograph shows the face of a great pharaoh peering up out of the sand. In an interview with the BBC in 2015, Frank Goddio explained that the policy of the IEASM underwater excavations was to learn as much as we can by touching as little as we can and leaving it for future technology. At that point, around 2% of the site had been excavated. The clay sediment from the Nile, which has hidden the ancient city for so long, also acts to protect the artifacts on the sea floor from the sea water. In the case of artifacts which are removed from their hidden underwater sanctuary, IEASM takes a great deal of care to restore and preserve them on board their ships and in laboratories. In some cases, this has taken days, but in others, such as that of the enormous Hapi statue, this took 2.5 years. Built on the Nile Delta, the city itself was traversed by a vast network of canals and was said to be stunningly beautiful. Dubbed the Venice of the Nile, Heracleion was at one point the largest port in the Mediterranean. Explorations of the site have concluded that the city probably gradually declined in importance as it slipped into the sea during the second half of the 8th century AD. This begs the question of why such a significant city was lost. The causes include a series of geological phenomena and cataclysmic events. IEASM joined forces with other institutions to conduct geological research, which has shown that the southeastern basin of the Mediterranean was affected by slow subsidence, the rise in sea levels, and local phenomenon related to the constitution of the soil in the area, which together formed the conditions for cities such as Heracleion to sink into the sea. In 2005, IEASM attained permission from the Egyptian authorities, who own the artifacts, to arrange a touring exhibition of the artifacts discovered. The resulting exhibition, entitled Egypt's Sunken Treasures, toured major cities in Germany, Spain, Italy, and Japan. The exhibition at the Grand Palais in France averaged a record of 7,500 visitors per day. The British Museum joined forces with Frank Goddio in 2015 to arrange its first underwater archaeology exhibition, which included about 200 artifacts discovered off the coast of Egypt by IEASM between 1996 and 2012. By then, Goddio estimated that they had explored only about 5% of the ancient city of Heracleion, estimated to cover an area of about 3.5 square kilometers, 1.3 miles. According to the art newspaper, Goddio stated that this would be a big undertaking on land, but under the sea and under the sediment, it's a task that will take hundreds of years. To understand the scale of this task, Heracleion is about 3 times the size of Pompeii, and archaeologists have been excavating that particular catastrophic site for over 100 years. The exhibition at the British Museum, entitled Sunken Cities, Egypt's Lost Worlds, was also presented at the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris in 2015 and at the St. Louis Art Museum in the United States. Its last stop was the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts up until January 2021, before the artifacts returned to Egypt. The discovery of Heracleion raises important questions about whether so-called mythical cities exist in reality. If a city once believed to be a myth can be uncovered from the depths of the sea, who knows what other legendary sunken cities of the past will be uncovered in the future? Only time will tell. A mysterious carved pyramid, hidden, has been discovered amid the thick trees and bushes on the slopes of Mount Kasagi in north-central Japan. Local folk belief connects the structure with a giant white snake that is said to reside within it. Some researchers believe this strange pyramid and other unexplained ancient remains at Atami, southwest of Tokyo, are surviving testimony to an Atlantean civilization who traveled over the Earth in the remote past. Atlantis. The magical lost land of Atlantis has captured the imagination of poets, scholars, archaeologists, geologists, occultists, and travelers for more than 2,000 years. The notion of a highly civilized advanced island civilization, which flourished in remote antiquity only to be destroyed overnight by a huge natural catastrophe, has inspired believers in the historical truth of the Atlantis tale to search practically every corner of the Earth for remnants of this once great civilization. Most archaeologists are of the opinion that the Atlantis story is just that, a story, an allegorical tale with no historical value whatsoever. And then there are the occultists, many of whom have approached the story of Atlantis from the standpoint that it represents either a lost spiritual homeland, like Mu, Lemuria, or a different plane of existence entirely. The original source from which all information about Atlantis ultimately derives is Greek philosopher Plato, in his two short dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written somewhere between 359 and 347 BC. Plato's supposed source for the story of Atlantis was a distant relative of his, a famous Athenian lawmaker and lyric poet called Solon. Solon had in turn heard the story on a visit to the court of Amasis, king of Egypt from 569 to 525 BC, in the city of Sais on the western edge of the Nile Delta. While at the court of Amasis, Solon visited the temple of Neith and fell into conversation with priests who related the story of Atlantis to him. The priest described a great island, larger than Libya and Asia combined, that had existed 9,000 years before their time beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Straits of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean. Atlantis was ruled over by an alliance of kings descended from Poseidon, god of the sea and earthquakes, whose eldest son, Atlas, gave his name to the island and the surrounding ocean. The Atlanteans possessed an empire that stretched from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean as far as Egypt in the south and Italy in the north. During an attempt to extend their empire further into the Mediterranean, the Atlanteans came up against the combined powers of Europe led by Athens, in this remote period already a great city and a society ruled by a warrior elite who disdained riches and lived a Spartan lifestyle. The armies of Atlantis were eventually defeated by the Athenians alone after their allies had deserted them. However, soon after the victory, there was a devastating earthquake, followed by huge floods, and the continent of Atlantis sank beneath the ocean in a single dreadful day and night, in the words of Plato. Explorers have been searching for a real Atlantis for hundreds of years. A couple of recent discoveries have persuaded some researchers that the remains of the great civilization lie not in the Mediterranean, as one might reasonably suppose, but thousands of miles further east in Japan. Japanese pyramids. Mount Kasagi is a 1,950-foot-high mountain located in Kasagi town, in the southeastern part of the Kyoto prefecture. Their area is fairly remote, but is known for its Buddhist temple known as Kasagi-dera Temple, which has a large image of the Buddha carved into the surface of a rock. Less known is an apparent pyramid in the foothills at the site. There isn't a lot of information available on the fairly small structure, but it has apparently been constructed from a single massive piece of granite, weighing approximately 9 tons. There are no markings anywhere on the pyramid or any indication as to who, if it is not merely a natural rock, fabricated it. One or two researchers have linked the structure with the pyramids of ancient Atlantis, believing it may be a relic left by Atlanteans who visited the area many thousands of years ago. There are no similar stones to be found anywhere around it, though there are reports of 4 other similar stone structures spaced 330 feet apart on the ridge of Mount Kasagi, 3 of them forming a triangular shape. One interesting fact concerning these pyramid-like stones is that the area is extremely rich in prehistoric rock art, which may indicate that it was seen as sacred in antiquity and was visited by some kind of ancient priesthood to perform rituals, possibly handed down from Atlantean refugees were performed at the pyramid as well. In an ancient ritual annually performed at the site, an offering of eggs is left at the pyramid for the serpentine spirit of the place, a sacred snake said to dwell at the site. Myths concerning sacred snakes and offerings of eggs are unknown elsewhere in Japan, or indeed Asia. But there are similar myths from Egypt concerning the eternal serpent called Neph or Onuphis, On meaning sun, Ophis meaning serpent. Kneph was frequently depicted as a serpent thrusting an egg from its mouth, while Ra himself was often worshipped as the egg within the serpent's coil. Some researchers have equated the serpent powers of Neph with the Benten, the Japanese Buddhist goddess of Mount Kasagi. The myth of Bentlen calls her the Lady of the White Serpents and describes her arrival in Japan after traveling across East Asia sometime around 1300 years ago. Her shrine in Shirahama, located deep in the rock caves of Sandabeki, is associated with water and the unconscious. A further connection to ancient Egypt is suggested by some researchers in the similarity between the name Benten and the Egyptian Benben, an Egyptian bird of immortality, akin to a phoenix. Interestingly, in ancient Egypt, the Benben stone is an object found in the mythology of the country. This fabled stone is said to have once been kept in a shrine within the compounds of the temple dedicated to the deity Atum in Heliopolis. Coincidentally or not, when considering the Japanese pyramid connection, the Benben stone is also an architectural term given to the tip of an obelisk or the capstone placed on top of a pyramid. Atami Atlantis. Whilst there have been no more of these miniature Atlantean-type pyramids found so far in Japan, there are other connections with ancient Atlantis. One of them can be found in the area of the city of Atami, at the northeastern base of the Izu Peninsula, less than an hour west of Tokyo. The city actually occupies the crater of the extinct volcano Mount Atami. The surrounding hills are the remains of the crater wall, which has been drowned by the sea to the east. Atami's mild and warm climate, scenic seascape, and hot springs have made it a favored resort since the 5th century AD. Noting its position inside an extinct volcano almost half beneath the sea, and the name Atami, some researchers believe that the city may have had a connection with Atlantis in prehistoric times. However, although some writers have claimed that the word Atami has no meaning in the Japanese language, it in fact means hot ocean, a reference to the town's famous onsen hot springs. One or two have even posited that an ancient volcanic eruption of Mount Atami and the destruction of a prehistoric city on the site may have in fact been the origin of the Atlantis story. They posit that refugees from the fabled land were forced to leave Atami and relocate elsewhere in Japan, probably to the coast of the Japanese island of Yonaguni, where there are a series of mysterious rock formations which some believe to be the remains of Atlantean structures. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura believes the ruins of a city off the coast of Yonagami Island on the southwestern tip of Japan could even be the lost land of Atlantis, or even Mu, a Pacific equivalent of the tale of the lost city of Atlantis. Kimura, a professor at Ryukyu University and the chairman of the non-profit Marine Science and Culture Heritage Research Association, said, "Judging by the design and the disposition of the ruins, the city must have looked just like an ancient Roman city. I can envisage a triumphal arch-like statue stood on the left of the Colosseum and a shrine over the hill. Kimura believes the submerged city had a castle, a shrine, an arch, statues, and a Colosseum. He said, "In my estimation, the castle was situated right in the middle of the city, and though not as big as the castle and a lot of ruins, Kimura believes the city was sunk in an earthquake 3,000 years ago." Perhaps unsurprisingly, many scientists dismiss this claim, saying the ruins can be explained by natural phenomena such as tidal or volcanic activity. Perhaps the most significant objection to Kimura's theory, however, is that no ancient artifacts such as clay pots or weapons have ever been found in the vicinity of the rock formation to prove that humans had once been present there. Kimura, however, remains positive and determined to prove his theory, saying, "I'm getting close to a conviction that this is a mysterious civilization lost in a tectonic deformation in the Pacific Ocean." Researchers believe they have uncovered the first clear example of a treasure the ancient Egyptians brought home with them from the legendary lost land of Punt. It is a 3,300-year-old baboon skull, a remnant of animal that was revered in ancient Egypt but was not native to the land of the pharaohs. The legendary treasures of Punt. The ancient Egyptians wrote about the land of Punt and depicted it as a prosperous location from 2450 BC to 1155 BC. They went to Punt, which they referred to as God's land, to acquire gold, African blackwood, ebony, ivory, aromatic raisins, wild animals, and slaves. One of the most famous artworks created about this location is the Punt colonnade on Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari, demonstrating that her people brought her myrrh trees, gold, ivory, panther skins, and apes back from Punt. The travels to Punt for treasures also demonstrate the ancient Egyptians' nautical skills. Nathaniel Dominy, a primatologist at Dartmouth College and lead author of the new study, explained that the long-distance seafaring between Egypt and Punt, two sovereign entities, was a major milestone in human history because it drove the evolution of maritime technology. Trade in exotic luxury goods, including baboons, was the engine behind early nautical innovations. Archaeologists believe that the land of the Punt was a real place. However, there is still a debate about where it was actually located. Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia are just a few of the proposed locations. This is why researchers have taken a particular interest in the 3,300-year-old baboon skull. If this baboon really did come from Punt, and they could identify its homeland, the mystery may be solved. Dominy states in a press release, "Many scholars view trade between Egypt and Punt as the first long maritime step in a trade network known as the Spice Route, which would go on to shape geopolitical fortunes for millennia. Other scholars put it more simply, describing the Egypt-Punt relationship as the beginning of economic globalization. Baboons were central to this commerce, so determining the location of Punt is important. For over 150 years, Punt has been a geographic mystery. Dominy says, "Our analysis is the first to show how mummified baboons can be used to inform this enduring debate." Analyzing the baboon skull. Even though there are records and artwork listing and depicting the goods Egyptians took from Punt, Science magazine reports that archaeologists have found little hard evidence for treasures from Punt to date. Dominy and his colleagues believe that their research will change that. They identified a Hamadryas baboon skull tucked away in the British Museum's archives and think that the fossil that was discovered in Thebes, Luxor, in the 19th century came from Punt. The results of their study, published on eLife, explains that they studied the chemical isotopes in the baboon's tooth enamel to try to pinpoint the animal's birthplace. Isotopic analysis is a useful tool for this endeavor because different places have distinct ratios of strontium isotopes in the soil and water, and this isotopic signature of the place where the animal lives the first years of their life is seen in their tooth enamel, thanks to the water they drink and the foods they consume. No matter where the animal lives later in life, their homeland's isotopic signature remains in their tooth enamel, unaltered by time. The results of the chemical analysis of the baboon skull show that the animal wasn't born in Egypt. In their paper, the researchers write that it came from a region that it encompasses much of present-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Djibouti, and portions of Somalia and Yemen. They write that this region corroborates the balance of scholarly conjecture on the location of Punt, and also is a testament to the tremendous reach of Egyptian seafaring during the 2nd millennium BC. Dominy says that this implies the baboon is the first known Puntite treasure. According to Science magazine, Catherine Bard, an archaeologist at Boston University, said that the baboon skull study provides another piece of evidence on where Punt was located. Bard believes that Punt is either in Eritrea or eastern Sudan. She also tells Science magazine that this isn't the first example of a treasure from Punt because her excavations at Mersa Wadi Gawasis unearthed obsidian ebony fragments, which she asserts came from Punt. Dominy disagreed, saying that ebony, for example, was widely distributed across Africa, so Bard's discovery was not necessarily a treasure from Punt. The ancient Egyptians linked Hamadryas baboons to their god of wisdom and the creator of hieroglyphics, Thoth and Amun-Ra, the sun god. They considered the animals sacred and depicted them in their sculptures, reliefs, and paintings, even though they're not native animals to Egypt. Egyptologist Dr. Geraldine Pinch has also noted that baboons were connected with Duat, the underworld in ancient Egyptian religion, saying, "The image of the Thoth baboon beside a Wedjat eye occurs on magic wands as early as the 20th century BC. Two baboon form of the god Khons control the Book of the End of the Year. These contain lists of those who were destined to die and those who would live." Anaut Balaji has written that baboons were associated with ancient Egyptian kings too. For example, King Nama is shown as being transformed into a baboon known as the Great White One as part of a rejuvenation festival scene. Bajaji noticed that some scholars opine that the title of this god is derived from the silver-grey mane of a dominant Hamadryas, and individual ancestors were ritually deified in the form of baboons and received cultic offerings. When archaeologists were excavating a dried-up lagoon known as Mersa Gawasis, they discovered traces of an ancient harbor that had helped launch early voyages like Hatshepsut's onto the open ocean. Man-made caves in the area contain timber, rigging, limestone anchors, steering oars, reed mats, cedar planks, and the remains of one of the oldest sea-going ships ever discovered. These artifacts have offered proof of the Egyptians' nautical skills and also provided important clues to the location of Punt. A more recent discovery adds weight to the evidence that Punt was located somewhere in Africa and not on the Arabian Peninsula. Science in Poland reports that archaeologists and ornithologists have identified a depiction of a bird on the portico of Punti in the Temple of Hatshepsut as a secretary bird, Sagittarius serpentarius, a very large bird of prey found only in Africa, particularly around coastal regions in Sudan. For centuries, the land of Punt has been delegated to the realm of myth and folklore, but more and more recent findings are making it clear that Punt was not a mythical place, it's a real location that is still waiting to be found.